The 8,256 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. At the outset of the meeting, I should like to take a moment to remember those killed yesterday in Gaza, as well as all those Palestinian, Israeli, and others who have died as a result of a conflict that has endured for far too long. I ask you all to observe a minute of silence in memory of them. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and personal representative of the Secretary General, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. Mr. Mladenov is joining us via video teleconference from Jerusalem. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Nikolai Mladenov.
Thank you, Madam President. Members of the Security Council. For the people of Gaza, yesterday was a day of tragedy. There are no other words with which to describe what actually happened. There is no justification for the killing. There is no excuse. It serves no one. It certainly does not serve the cause of peace. My heart weighs heavy today as I begin by expressing my condolences to the families of those killed yesterday and in the last 6 weeks of demonstrations in Gaza. Who can possibly find words to console the mother of a child that has been killed? Who? I call on all to join me today in condemning in the strongest possible terms the actions that have led to the loss of many lives in Gaza. Israel has a responsibility to calibrate its use of force, to not use lethal force except as a last resort under imminent threat of death or serious injury. It must protect its borders, but it must do so proportionally and investigate every incident that has led to a loss of human life. Hamas, which has controlled Gaza for over a decade, must not use the protests as cover to attempt to place bombs at the fence and create provocations. Its operatives must not hide among the demonstrators and risk the lives of civilians. Madam President, tens of thousands of people in Gaza have been protesting for over 6 weeks now. People who live in abject poverty, who survive in prison-like conditions, who live with no prospect for the day after. These people want their voices heard. They want a future beyond mere survival. Their leaders have failed them. The promises that they have made to them have not been delivered. And now the people are angry. But their anger, if not channeled in a constructive manner, will lead to more destruction and suffering. Whatever we may think of their motivation, we have an obligation to hear their plight. They have lived through 3 devastating conflicts. Their lives are marked by personal anguish, scarred by national tragedy, marred by daily suffering caused by leaders who use them for their own political ends. For 10 years, they have lived under the control of Hamas, separated from their families in the West Bank, isolated behind crippling Israeli closures. The cycle of violence in Gaza needs to end. And for it to end, it needs every single one of us to put their best efforts into preventing an explosion that can drag the whole region into another deadly confrontation. The international community must step in and prevent war. We need to move forward quickly and effectively on all projects that have been discussed for months and months to solve the energy, water and health crisis of the population. We can only do this in coordination with Israel, with the Palestinian Authority and with Egypt. But before all of that, the senseless violence needs to stop. Mr. President, yesterday an estimated 35,000 people participated in demonstrations in Gaza and hundreds in the West Bank, cities of Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, Nablus, and in East Jerusalem, all part of the Great March of Return, as well as in protest to the relocation of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. While no fatalities were reported in the West Bank, where limited clashes took place between demonstrators and Israeli security forces at several checkpoints, the situation in Gaza deteriorated throughout the day, particularly along the perimeter fence. According to various reports, at least 60 people were killed throughout yesterday, including 6 children, and more than 1,300 were reportedly injured by live ammunition and rubber bullets. 1 Israeli soldier was wounded and taken to hospital for treatment. Since the beginning of the protests on March 30th, over 100 people have been killed, including 13 children, over half of whom yesterday alone. This constituted the bloodiest day in Gaza, with the highest death and injury toll since the conflict of 2014. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have acknowledged that among those killed were members of their organizations, and the Israeli Defense Forces claims that at least 24 had linked to militant activities. Under cover of the protests, Hamas and other militants have also engaged in violent and provocative acts, including the placing of improvised explosive devices at the perimeter fence, and other attempts to breach it with the intent of perpetrating attacks. According to the UNDSS, at least 1 IED reportedly detonated against an IDF vehicle during an incursion. 18 airstrikes and 8 shelling incidents were also carried out by the Israeli security forces on 26 Hamas targets in retaliation for what Israel has classified as violent acts. Madam President, against this backdrop, hospitals in Gaza report an unfolding crisis of essential medical supplies. Drugs and equipment is needed to treat those who have been injured. The United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator, who is currently in Gaza, yesterday visited the Shifa Hospital, where there is a shortage of beds for the number of wounded arriving from the protests at the fence. He witnessed firsthand patients being brought in on stretchers and left in the hospital's courtyard, which was being used as a triage area. I appeal to Israel, to Egypt, to the Palestinian authorities to facilitate the exit from Gaza of the seriously wounded for medical treatment, and I welcome steps reportedly taken in this direction by Egypt. Madam President, I would like to take the opportunity to salute the bravery of the medical staff who continue to put their own lives at risk, such as those working for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society who have endured casualties of their own. I'm deeply saddened to note the death of another health worker yesterday during the demonstrations, and I reiterate the inviolability under international law of health facilities and medical personnel. Journalists have also been among those injured in yesterday's demonstrations. The dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, about which I have reported time and again in this chamber over the past year, has been compounded by the fact that the Palestinian Authority continues to withhold the payment of salaries to some 20,000 civil service employees in Gaza. To further complicate a dismal picture, on the 4th and on the 11th of May, demonstrators destroyed most of the facilities at the Gaza side of the Kerem Shalom crossing, the main point of entry for goods and materials into the Gaza Strip. Members of my team have conducted an initial assessment of the site, and I can report that the damage is extensive and will hinder deliveries of fuel and much-needed goods to Gaza for weeks ahead. As we speak, the United Nations is working with the Palestinian Authority and with Israel to bring in life-saving assistance, despite the destruction and the extensive damage to the crossing. Mr. President, whoever orchestrated that destruction shares in the responsibility of worsening the suffering of 2 million people in Gaza. Madam President, the Secretary General and I have repeatedly called on all to exercise restraint, for all necessary steps to be taken to avoid an escalation, and for all incidents to be fully investigated. I have engaged with all sides to this effect. Public statements and messages by Hamas indicate the intention to use mass protests to infiltrate into Israel and attack Israelis. Such statements and action endanger the lives of both Israelis and Palestinians and cannot be justified. I wish to underline yet again that it is imperative that civilians, particularly children, not be targeted by anyone, use or not be used for cover of militant activity or be put in risk or in danger in any way. Madam President, as the violence continues, technical problems have also resurfaced in further decreasing the electricity supply and have currently caused some 22 hours of blackouts in Gaza. This is a critical reminder of the fragility of Gaza's infrastructure. Starting tomorrow, the United Nations, together with international partners, will need to focus and redouble efforts to implement projects that will have an immediate impact on improving the electricity, water and health situation as a matter of urgency. The developments in Gaza are a painful reminder, an extremely painful reminder of the devastating consequences of the continued absence of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I would like to reiterate this message, particularly as Palestinians commemorate the Nakba Day, or the Day of the Catastrophe, by which they remember the displacement during the war of 1948-49, and as they continue to demonstrate in Gaza and the West Bank over the coming days. We must step up our efforts in support of a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We must collectively call on all to refrain from unilateral measures that only steer us away from a peace process and instead work to end the occupation and advance the goal of a just and sustainable peace, culminating ultimately in two states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, two states living side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mladenov for his briefing, and now I give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيدة.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we'd like to thank you for your speedy response to our request to hold this emergency session. Moreover, we'd like to thank Mr. Nikolai Mladenov, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for this important briefing today on the tragic events that have recently taken place in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in the Gaza Strip. We would like to condemn in the strongest terms the massacre perpetrated by the Israeli occupation authorities yesterday, which have led over to the killing of 52 persons and thousands of wounds who have joined the martyrs that have fallen since the Palestinian question and tragedy began. And this is a part of the commemoration of the Nakba that has taken place 70 years ago. And these Israeli violations are simply a continuation of Israel violations of international humanitarian law and international law and the Security Council resolutions. They would not have continued if the Security Council has taken a firm stand against them and called Israel to stop these practices. And here we would like to express our regret that the Security Council was unable to adopt the draft statement that the Kuwait has suggested yesterday, and which calls upon ending Israel's practices and conducting a transparent and independent investigation into the massacres perpetrated against the unarmed Palestinians and holding those responsible accountable. And in the Council's continued inability to take any measure in order to establish an investigative mechanism, then we will make a move in the General Assembly or in the Human Rights Council in order to guarantee that those perpetrating these acts are held accountable and do not live in impunity. And we would also like to submit suggestions to avoid the excessive use of force by the Israeli occupation authorities and the continued violence. And we call for taking measures that would guarantee offering international protection to the Palestinian people. And here we would like to confirm what has been stipulated by Resolution 605 and 904 by the Security Council in order to apply the Fourth Geneva Convention on what is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories and the need to offer international protection to the unarmed Palestinian people. Madam President, we express our deep concern over the unilateral measures that Israel, the occupying authority, is undertaking. And these aim to change facts on the ground in the occupied territories, the most prominent of which is the continued settlement activity and the expansion of existing settlements, which are illegal and illegitimate measures that are a clear violation of Security Council resolutions, international law, and especially Resolution 2334. Moreover, transferring some diplomatic missions to Jerusalem is a clear violation of Security Council resolutions of relevance, especially resolutions 476 and 478. These resolutions consider such unilateral measures to be null and void. We would like to confirm that such measures that violate international law only serve to undermine efforts to achieve peace, deepen tensions, and cause and enrage anger, as well as push the region towards more violence, chaos, and instability. The state of Kuwait supports Palestinian demands in order to activate some international mechanisms that currently exist, such as the International Quartet, by expanding its membership to include other regional elements, provided that it remains under the aegis of the United Nations as a sponsor of the peace process. Moreover, we support all legal and peaceful measures taken by the sisterly state of Palestine at the national and international levels in order to entrench and enhance its sovereignty over Al-Quds al-Sharif and the occupied Palestinian territories. We also confirm that the peace required must start with an end to Israeli occupation that is about to complete its 51st year in a few days. And this must be based on international legitimacy resolutions as well as the Land for Peace principle and the roadmap and the Arab Peace Initiative that was adopted by all Arab states at the Beirut Summit in the year 2002. And this must be based on Israel's withdrawal from all Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese territories occupied and until the June 1967 borders. And it must also deal with all final status solutions and must lead to the enjoyment of the Palestinian people of all their political legitimate rights, including the right to self-determination and establishing an independent state with East Jerusalem as their capital. The Palestinian people are looking to the United Nations and the Security Council to activate what this organization has taken upon itself in order to achieve the maintenance of international peace and security. Here, we would like to renew our full solidarity with the sisterly Palestinian people in order to defend their just cause and their legitimate rights, including their historic and firm rights in Jerusalem, which have been guaranteed by the relevant international resolutions. We confirm that East Jerusalem is the capital of the State of Palestine. We call on countries to recognize the State of Palestine and occupied East Jerusalem as its capital. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's session was called to discuss the issue of violence in the Middle East. We are all concerned about violence in the Middle East. The United States deplores the loss of human life. But there is a lot of violence throughout the region, and I will note that the double standard is all too common in this chamber and working overtime today. Last week, Iranian forces attacked Israeli positions on the Golan Heights by launching rockets from Syria. This was a reckless provocation and escalation that must be stopped. It is an example of regional violence that should occupy our attention here in the Security Council. Also last week, Iranian proxy forces in Yemen launched missiles into Saudi Arabia. It was not the first time they have done it. This, too, is regional violence that should occupy our attention here in the Security Council. In recent days, Hamas terrorists, backed by Iran, have incited attacks against Israeli security forces and infrastructure. That is violence that should occupy our attention, too. The common thread in all of this is the destabilizing conduct of the Iranian regime, a regime that insists on promoting violence throughout the Middle East while depriving its own people of basic human rights. The United States welcomes a discussion of this violence in the Middle East. We welcome discussing the ways we can cooperate with each other to put an end to this violence. There is far too little discussion in the Security Council on Iran's destabilizing presence in Syria, its promotion of violence in Yemen, its support for terrorism in Gaza, and its dangerous and illegal weapons buildup in Lebanon. However, in the minds of some, today's meeting was not called to discuss any of those examples of violence in the Middle East. Today's meeting was called to discuss the violence that some suggest was connected with yesterday's opening of the United States Embassy in Jerusalem. For some people, the embassy opening is said to be a reason to engage in violence. How is that justified? As our president said when he announced the decision in December, the location of our embassy has no bearing on the specific boundaries of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem or the resolution of contested borders. It has no bearing on Jerusalem's holy sites. It does not prejudge whatever the parties might negotiate in a peace agreement. It does not undermine the prospects for peace in any way. And yet, for some, this is supposedly a cause for violence. But let's remember that the Hamas terrorist organization has been inciting violence for years, long before the United States decided to move our embassy. In recent days, multiple news organizations have documented the Hamas incitement in Gaza. They have reported that Hamas maps and social media show the fastest routes to reach Israeli communities in case demonstrators make it through the security fence. They have reported on Hamas messages over loudspeakers that urge demonstrators to burst through the fence, falsely claiming Israeli soldiers were fleeing, when in fact they were not. The same loudspeakers are used by Hamas to urge the crowds to, quote, get closer to the security fence. Hamas has attacked the Karem Shalom crossing, the biggest entry point in Gaza for fuel, food, and medical supplies. This is how determined they are to make the lives of the Palestinian people miserable. They light Molotov cocktails attached to kites on fire and attempt to fly them into Israel to cause as much destruction as possible. When asked yesterday why he put a swastika on his burning kite, the terrorist responded, quote, "The Jews go crazy when you mention Hitler," unquote. This is what is endangering the people of Gaza. Make no mistake, Hamas is pleased with the results from yesterday. I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has. In fact, the records of several countries here today suggest they would be much less restrained. Those who suggest that the Gaza violence has anything to do with the location of the American embassy are sorely mistaken. Rather, the violence comes from those who reject the existence of the state of Israel in any location. Such a motivation, the destruction of a United Nations member state, is so illegitimate as to not be worth our time in the Security Council, other than the time it takes to denounce it. Yesterday's opening of our embassy in Jerusalem is a cause for celebration for the American people. Moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was the right thing to do. It reflects the will of the American people. It reflects our sovereign right to decide the location of our embassy, a right that everyone in this room claims for their own country. Importantly, moving our embassy to Jerusalem also reflects the reality that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It has served as Israel's capital since the founding of the state. It is the ancient capital of the Jewish people. There is no plausible peace agreement under which Jerusalem would no longer remain the capital of Israel. Recognizing this reality makes peace more achievable, not less. The United States is prepared to support peace negotiations and a peace agreement in every way. We want nothing more than peace, a peace in which people of all faiths are free to worship in Jerusalem, a peace in which the rights of all people are respected and the future prospects of all people is bright. That peace will only be achieved if it is rooted in the realities that too many choose to deny. The United States' action yesterday promoted the reality and the desire for peace. It is our sincere wish that the nations of the world will join us in this pursuit of credible, realistic, and enduring peace. As I conclude, I want to take a moment to mark the 70th anniversary of Israel's independence. In this United Nations Security Council, on behalf of the American people, I congratulate our friends in Israel on the remarkable achievement of 70 years of independence. From humble and desperate beginnings, a proud people have realized the prophet Isaiah's vision of a light unto the nations. May the next 70 years be ones of strength, of hope, and of peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of United States for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President, and thank you very much to Mr. Mladenov for that very sobering briefing. I'd like to start by thanking him and his staff for everything they're doing to try and calm down the violence, and also echo his tribute to the medical staff on the ground and his appeal for facilitation of evacuation of the wounded. Madam President, we've seen a concatenation of loss of life, casualties, volume of live fire in Gaza yesterday, and this has been shocking and I think appalling to most of us. It is a familiar, depressingly familiar pattern that we have seen over recent weeks, and it includes the deaths of children. At a highly sensitive time in the region, we call for calm and we call for restraint. A further escalation of violence serves no one's interests. It is only destructive to peace efforts and to wider regional security. Madam President, we understand that 60 people were killed yesterday in Gaza, 6 of them children. Around 2,771 people were reported injured, and that included over 1,300 by live ammunition. The death toll on Monday means that more 90 Palestinians have been killed in the past 6 weeks for approaching the fence that has been placed round Gaza. There is an urgent need, we believe, to establish the facts around yesterday's events, including why such a volume of live fire continues to be deemed justified. The Palestinian right to peaceful protest is undeniable, but at the same time, we are deeply concerned that peaceful protests in Gaza are being exploited by extremist elements. For example, we've seen IDF troops targeted by IEDs, and we've seen the use of Molotov cocktails. This is not acceptable. The Palestinians have a right to peaceful protest, and Israel has an undeniable right to protect its borders from Hamas and other terrorist groups and threats. The United Kingdom remains strongly supportive of Israel's right to defend itself. We recognise today as a sensitive anniversary for the Palestinians. We implore Israel to act with restraint in accordance with international law and, more than anything, to ensure that its security forces do not resort to the use of excessive force. The volume of live fire used in Gaza yesterday and the consequent number of deaths is distressing and cannot be ignored by the Council. I want to reiterate the United Kingdom's support for independent and transparent investigations into the events that have taken place and in recent weeks, and including the extent to which Israeli security forces' rules of engagement are in line with international law. The death toll alone warrants such a comprehensive inquiry, and we continue to urge that the findings of these investigations be made public, and if wrongdoing is found, that those responsible be held to account. Madam President, our position on the status of Jerusalem and the move of the American Embassy is well known. Our position is clear and long-standing. The status of Jerusalem should be determined in a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Jerusalem should ultimately be the shared capital of the Israeli and Palestinian states. We need to look forward and we need to work urgently towards a resolution of the long-standing issues between Israel and the Palestinian people. Like this Council, the United Kingdom is committed to a two-state solution with Jerusalem as a shared capital and to achieving peace and stability in the wider region. We see negotiations towards a two-state solution as the best way to end the occupation and to meet the national aspirations of the Jewish and Palestinian peoples. But now more than ever, Madam President, we need a political process that delivers a two-state solution. We agree with the envoy that the situation in Gaza is desperate and deteriorating, and that the international community must step up its efforts. To that end, Madam President, I'd like to close by making a request of the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process that he and his office bring forward proposals to address the situation in Gaza. These should include easing restrictions on access and movement, and it should include international support for urgent infrastructure and economic development projects. We also reiterate our support for the Egyptian-led reconciliation process and the return of the Palestinian Authority to full administration of the Gaza Strip. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation wishes to thank you for having convened this meeting, and also the delegation of Kuwait for having called for it to be convened. Laila Anwar Al-Gandor, 8 months old. Els Ilbin Muhammad Al-Samak, 14 years old. Misal Fahd El-Sad El-Sheikh Khalid, 15 years old. Ahmed Adel Musa Al-Shahed, 16 years old. Sahed Mohammed Abu Al-Ked, 16 years old. Ibrahim Ahmed Al-Saka, 18 years old. Iman Ali Sadiq Al-Sheikh, 19 years old. Saeed Mohammed Hassan Ahmad, 19 years old. Matasen Fasi Abu Luli, 20 years old. Anas Hamdam Salim Kader, 21 years old. These are the 10 first people on the list of those who were killed by the security forces of the occupying power yesterday in Gaza. Today we had a minute of silence to recall the victims. But I think that minute of silence, too, also recalls the inoperative nature of the Security Council, that this Security Council, not just in recent years, but in recent decades, has failed the Palestinian people. And so, as a member of the Security Council, in the presence of my brother, the ambassador of Palestine, with us today, and through him, I wish to ask for forgiveness and say how sorry I am to the 6 million of Palestinian refugees who've lost their homes and today live in camps far from the lands that saw their birth. I am sorry that for 70 years, the promise of the creation of the State of Palestine has not been fulfilled. I'm sorry for the more than 50 years of occupation and the continued increase of Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. The international community has failed you. I'm sorry at the 10 years of inhumane blockade of Gaza and the building of a shameful wall along the West Bank. I'm sorry that there are Israeli checkpoints that they must pass through daily to go to work. The international community has failed you. I wish to ask for forgiveness from the over 97 Palestinian men and women, 12 of whom were children, who lost their lives in the last 6 weeks since the Great March of Return began. The international community, this Security Council, has failed you. I wish to ask forgiveness and say I'm sorry to the over 12,000 Palestinian men, women, older people, and children who were injured by the Israeli aggression, over 3,500 of whom were injured in various degrees by live munition, leading to permanent disability. The international community has failed you. I wish to say I am sorry to the more than 300 girls and boys held in Israeli prisons or detention centers, some subject to military courts, others simply under administrative detention. The international community has failed you. I wish to say I'm sorry to the 169 health workers who were wounded while they provided emergency services to the Palestinians along the fence separating Israel from Gaza. They, too, have been failed by the international community. I wish to say I'm sorry because there were 18 ambulances damaged in recent weeks, hospitals and health centers in Gaza which have collapsed without enough fuel, water, and electric supplies to operate. I wish to say I'm sorry because of the 4 hours of electricity provided per day. The international community has failed them. Madam President, I believe it is necessary to clarify that although there are two parties to this conflict, so-called conflict, it's not really a conflict. We're talking about an illegal occupation. We are talking about an occupying power and an occupied territory. They are not on an equal footing. I was saying that Israel is the occupying power. The other, Palestine, is an occupied people. There is a historic, glaring inequality. One of the parties has used and continues to use force to occupy the territory of the other. One of the parties forcibly displaces civilians, confiscates lands, demolishes houses, and transfers settlers to illegally built settlements. One of the parties is blockading Gaza with terrible humanitarian consequences. As Mr. Mladinov appropriately said, Gaza has become a kind of prison subject to these conditions. Madam President, added to this, the unilateral decision of the government of the United States of America to transfer its embassy to the occupied city of Jerusalem does nothing but inflame spirits. Once again, Bolivia expresses its strongest condemnation for this decision, which violates resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. The United States, which supports the occupying power, has become an obstacle to peace. It is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Madam President, After the events we have witnessed, Bolivia believes that the mechanisms of the International Criminal Court should be triggered to conduct an investigation which identifies those responsible and bring them to justice for the crimes committed during the Great March of Return. Against this scenario, we express our firm commitment with all international efforts leading to a peaceful solution to this conflict. And we add our support to initiatives such as the Quartet's Roadmap, the Madrid Principles, the Arab Peace Initiative, and others, which are guarantees for fair, lasting peace so that both peoples can live within recognized secure borders. We reaffirm our conviction that the only solution over the long term is the two-state solution, which will finally consolidate a free, sovereign, independent state of Palestine with borders previous to 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. To conclude, Madam President, we have heard mention of Iran over and over again. We have heard Hamas, Hamas, Hamas over and over again. But we haven't heard mention of the real reason for this situation, which is the occupation, the occupation, the occupation. Once the occupation comes to an end, then we can talk about compliance with the resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. Bolivia will never, ever justify terrorism. But at the same time, we will not fall into the trap of hearing that the problem is Hamas, when the basic problem, the essential problem, is that a state recognized by this organization is illegally occupying the territory of another state. It is subjecting a people to inhumane, subhuman conditions. This is a systematic violation of the Charter of the United Nations. It is only when the occupation comes to an end that we can say that we have done our duty. Thank you, Madam.
I thank the representative of Bolivia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you, Special Coordinator Mladenov, for your very sobering briefing this morning. As we had the open debate only some 2 weeks ago, I will focus my remarks today on the immediate situation in Gaza. Madam President, we are appalled by the violence that we have witnessed in Gaza since the March 30th, and in particular the sharp escalation yesterday. Every lost life is a tragedy, but the numbers of killed was the highest in a single day since the beginning of the protests. Indeed, it was the bloodiest day since the last conflict in Gaza in 2014. Yesterday, at least 60 Palestinians were killed by Israeli security forces and over 2,000 were wounded. Yet again, the Israeli security forces used live ammunition, including when shooting at children. There are reports that several children under the age of 18 were amongst those killed yesterday, in addition to the 7 children killed in the preceding weeks. We condemn the killings, and we express our condolences for the tragic loss of life. As we have stated repeatedly, Israel has a right to protect itself and the people within its borders. That said, Israel, as the occupying power, has a responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians and must fully respect the right to peaceful protest, protect civilians, and ensure that the use of force and other measures taken are strictly proportional. Lethal use of force should be exercised with maximum restraint and only as a last resort. These incidents raise serious concerns as to their compatibility with international law, and there must be an independent and transparent investigation as called for by the Secretary General, among many others. We urge all parties to act with the utmost restraint to avoid further loss of life and to protect civilians, particularly children. This means never making children the target of violence, as well as not putting children in harm's way or encouraging them to participate in violence. We urge the Israeli security forces to refrain from the use of force against unarmed civilian protesters and representatives of